So a prominent example of where we see the national power trumping state power would be the Supreme Court case of McCulloch versus Maryland, in which the Supreme Court made its ruling in 1819. A little bit of background, essentially the state of Maryland attempted to tax a branch of the U.S. bank that existed in the state of Maryland. And the court essentially ruled that the national government had the ability, under the Elastic Clause, to create a national bank, and this was one of its implied powers. And the court ruled that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and because the states cannot destroy the national government is supreme. And so this attempt of taxation was deemed to be unconstitutional and illegal. And so two important principles that came out of this ruling. The first is that the Constitution grants to Congress implied powers for implementing the Constitution's express powers. Secondly, state action may not impede valid constitutional exercise of power by the federal government. So again, McCulloch versus Maryland really reiterated national supremacy over state power. So an important way in which the federal government relinquishes or shares some of the power with the states is through money, which is one of the essence of our government. And the most common way in which the federal government shares money with state governments is through grants. And the official term are grants and aids, which, if this appears on a test, that simply means money from a federal government given to a state government. So there are several reasons why the federal government gives money to state governments. The first is to reduce growth of federal bureaucracy. So instead of states having to climb up the ladder to find the appropriate person in the federal government whom to ask for money, the national government just gives the money to the state leaders, and then the state leaders decide how to spend and allocate those resources. Secondly, the federal government gives states necessary money. California has been in a financial crisis for several years now and has come to rely on the federal government to help alleviate some of that financial burden. Thirdly, the federal government gives states grants to establish minimum federal standards. So it's through federal grants that the federal government can then set standards for air quality, for transportation standards. And without these resources, states would not be able to meet the standards, so these grants allow the states to do this. And finally, federal grants equalize resources between rich and poor states. If we compare state to state, each of the 50 states is dealing in a different financial category, and so the federal government really makes an attempt to stabilize the gap between the rich and the poor states. And you might be wondering, where does this money come from? Most often, grants are going to be given when the federal government is operating in a surplus. Our federal government tends to be operating in a deficit, which is why grants are pretty difficult to come by. But in the event that the federal government does have excess or surplus funds, grants are given to the different states. There are two types of grants that are most commonly given: block grants and categorical grants. Block grants are chunks of money given to state for a very general purpose. So for example, if the federal government gives the state of California a block grant for transportation, it's up to the leaders in the state of California to decide specifically how that money will be spent in transportation. And the details of that are completely left up to the state legislature. So where, when, how, the state really gets to decide. And so that's the federal government giving power to the states through the money. Categorical grants are monies given to states for a very specific purpose. So for example, the federal government often gives states money labeled No Child Left Behind funds. And so this is money that is specifically earmarked to give schools who are seeing increasing or test scores that meet the certain standard. And so this is the national government exercising certain power, because when they give the states the money, they tell them specifically how, when, and why they're going to spend this. And the most common type of categorical grants are also known as formula grants, and this is when the national government gives states money for a specific program based on factors like population or income. So it's being even more explicit in exactly how the states are able to spend these funds.